distracted by the finer things in life. You look shattered and he's broke, and all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you, and the fine line between wrong and right.
Growing old can mean a new chapter in life, and elderly locals are an important part of every community. So in 2003, a small town on the south coast of England was rocked by a violent crime on one of their own.
Burglars breaking into a house when people are asleep is rare, but burglars breaking into a house and murdering somebody so rare is untrue.
My husband Eric did not deserve this. As a frail man, any resistance he put up could easily have been overcome by these two young men. There was no need for them to go to the lengths they did.
The victims of this crime had got married in the later years of their lives and were hoping to grow old together. Sometimes things just don't go to plan when the very home that was meant to be a sanctuary becomes the scene of a brutal attack.
Plymouth is a large city in the southwest of England, the largest city in Devon, a major naval port. From a policing point of view, it's got many different neighbourhoods.
Plymouth as a whole is an interesting city because it is a city, but it's a city that's made up of little villages. One of those villages is Plympton, St Maurice. It's a little pocket community, had its own butcher shop, a little pub, a couple of little shops. Lots of families had been in the area for a really long time.
And it's fair to say that Plympton is not a high crime area.
It's a really tight, close community, and they look out for each other.
One of the prominent figures in the neighbourhood was 83-year-old Eric Hingston. He ran the local family butchers in Plympton for many years.
Eric had been a very active man. He'd had active war service, and then he'd worked in the butcher shop for many years up until his retirement. He still lived above the shop. He was a very intrinsic part of that community. His son had taken over the shop from him, but he was still a very familiar face. He used to go round to the pub close by. Everybody knew Eric.
Eric hadn't always been a butcher. Aged 18, he got his pilot's licence and joined the RAF.
Eric had an incredibly interesting past. He was part of a special operations group during the war, which flew covert missions into occupied France. An incredibly dangerous expedition, something that his family were incredibly proud of.
In 1950, Eric married his first wife, Jean. They had 2 children together.
After the war, Eric set up a butcher's shop, and I think he was 3 shops in the St Austell area. And then after his first wife died, he moved back to Plymouth and bought a shop in Underhill Lane.
Eric's wife, Jean, died in 1982.
And here he is, a widower, confronting, life without his life partner. I have no one to share my life with. So that's where we find Eric.
So it was widely welcomed a few years later when 62-year-old Eric found love again, this time with 60-year-old widow Audrey.
Audrey was friends with Eric prior to the death of the respective partners, and they were just friends. And I think that friendship blossomed, and eventually they married. Of course, both sides of the family had family. Eric had a family, and Audrey had a family, including sons and grandsons and granddaughters.
So Eric meets Audrey, who's also a widow. So they already have something in common. They've been through that loss process as individuals. They meet, they get together, and they get married. So from Eric's point of view, he's found love again.
They like to travel abroad, they like to go into the city centre and have a cup of coffee and look around the shops together.
Because Audrey was quite a spry woman and she was very fit for her age. And it's even been said that she wouldn't think twice about walking into Plymouth if she missed the bus, which would be 3 miles perhaps into the city centre. So she was very fit and very sociable.
They had an active life and one that they both enjoyed, and a caring relationship.
But when he turned 80, Eric's health took a severe downturn.
All of a sudden, Eric's got heart problems, he's asthmatic, he's got a catheter, he's had a hip replacement, the car's gone, the social life's disappeared. Audrey's looking after a very sick man.
Life changed for the couple following Eric's illness, and Audrey became his full-time carer. All of their future plans went on hold.
It meant Audrey changed from a companion to almost a carer. And I think there was quite a change in their life.
What happens when one partner gets ill and the other person perhaps takes on the role of carer is there's a shift in the power dynamic. It goes from being equal to I now look after him. So from her point of view, it might have been a very difficult position to find herself in. And I think from Eric's point of view, losing his health in that way may have also made him feel less than in the relationship. Here we are as equals and suddenly I'm not able to do what I used to do. He may have felt some level of guilt, perhaps, that he can't be the man that she thought she married.
But Eric and Audrey seemed determined to make the best of things. Getting out locally as often as they could, they were well known in the area. Neighbour Sean Rouse still remembers seeing them throughout his childhood.
You would see them in the morning. You see them, they would be down at the front and you'd see them, you say hello, you know, the usual. They were lovely. Like, they'd always say hello. They weren't people that would just ignore you. They were genuine nice people.
On Friday 29th of August at 3:45 a.m, a panicked Audrey Hingston called 999.
999, which service do you require?
I received a phone call somewhere 4 o'clock in the morning to say that there'd been an incident at Underwood Road, Plympton. I attended the scene.
Audrey said intruders had broken into the couple's flat and had stabbed her husband Eric. He had been seriously wounded. The emergency services responded immediately. Detective Chief Inspector Tony Carney was the senior investigating officer on duty that night.
Even after 17 years, it hasn't changed at all. In terms of looking at this scene, no, there's no difference whatsoever in the past 17 years. The road was taped off here, and there were police on the barrier, as it were, because they were diverting traffic. I came over to the door here and had a look at it. I noticed that there was no signs of forcible entry to the door, so I knocked on the glass, and funnily enough, it was answered by Audrey, who appeared in a very confused and shocked state.
Audrey's life had been torn apart. Her home had been invaded, Eric attacked, and now her home was a crime scene.
And I think I was actually a paperboy at the time, had just started. And I just remember walking down from just up there, walking past and seeing all the tape.
Audrey, she was a very small woman. She was very neat and tidy. But she was obviously confused. She was upset. She was frightened. And you automatically felt sorry for her right away. And no, I wanted to get her away from the house.
Paramedics had got there within minutes, but it was already too late.
Audrey said that her husband had been attacked, and that is when we went upstairs to find Eric.
Eric Hingston had been found dead on the floor of the flat above the butcher's in the quiet Plymouth suburb of Plympton. his fragile 81-year-old wife Audrey had made the desperate call to police.
Eric had been killed by a downward thrust from a long, sharp-bladed instrument. There wasn't a lot of blood at all. Eric was lying on the floor. His head was on a cushion, which I thought was strange at first. But then I saw patches on the floor and realised that he'd been defibrillated. What they hadn't realised, of course, was that Eric had a pacemaker. When the heart stops beating, the pacemaker kicks in to try and start it again, and it gives a sort of a false pulse, if you like. And this is what the paramedics had picked up, and they therefore thought that there was still life in Eric and tried to resuscitate him.
Senior investigating officer Tony tried to find out as much as he could from Audrey about what had happened.
She was sort of leaning forward, if you like, cringing, confused, frightened, and not absolutely coherent. She was sleeping in a different room to her husband, and she'd heard a disturbance. She went into the room where he was sleeping. She was confronted by two men, two burglars, who, on seeing her, escaped through the open bedroom window, leaving behind a black bin liner by the window with the sort of items that they were intending to steal.
What looked like a robbery was now a murder inquiry, and a large police team was assembled, including Detective Inspector Neil Treby.
The body was taken to Derriford Hospital, and Audrey was taken by the family liaison officer to her son's address. Now, her son was a retired detective sergeant, and he lived in the city with his family. She needed support.
One of the other reasons we wanted to get her out of the house was that unintentionally she could well have contaminated the scene, if disturbed any evidence that there might be. So it was important for us to get her away. Obviously, we'd got work to do.
Police arrived at the house to search for any evidence left by the burglars that Audrey had seen.
The forensic team arrived and they cordoned off the building.
It looked like a typical burglary scene. The wardrobe doors were open, the drawers had been drawn open, the contents had been disturbed, thrown out onto the floor. There was a black bin liner by the window which had got items in it, including jewellery and other items, attractive items that they might want to steal.
When people enter premises, they will leave traces. They will leave articles of clothing. There could be skin, there could be a number of things. Bearing in mind we had, in this particular case, a stabbing. There'd be traces of blood. The splattering of blood can be important when you try and work out what level of force was used, where the body was, where the assailant was stood. All of these things can be important.
By morning, the whole community was aware something serious had gone on.
There was reports of a lot of police activity. We'd sent reporters and a cameraman down there to go and see what they could find out. We'd had whispers that there had been a murder, so it was obvious that something big had happened.
It was just, you could tell around the place, it was just shock. It was dead quiet. Everybody was stood on the other side of the road trying to figure out what was going on. And literally along here was literally just people just standing there and watching. You had police up and around everywhere.
There were killers in the community, and the clock was ticking. Forensic teams searched for clues as to who these deadly intruders might be.
The door that you can see there opens onto a flat-roofed extension, which has got a felt roof cover. And the window, as on the night in question, 29th of August, would have been open. That's the very window. Open now as it was then.
Eric had a medical condition which caused him breathing difficulties. He would often sleep upright in bed with the window open.
The burglars would have placed a ladder on top of a wheelie bin and climbed onto that flat roof and then gained access to the bedroom where Eric was sleeping in bed with the light on, window open, something that normally you would think would deter burglars from entering.
Burglars breaking into a house when people are asleep is rare, but burglars breaking into a house and murdering somebody in the house is even rarer. And on this occasion, the victim was an elderly man who was bedridden, and there would really be no requirement to murder somebody who was sat up in a bed, because he wasn't a threat, physical threat, he couldn't be. The only possibility is that he would have seen the burglars.
And then we got called along to a press conference later on that morning. We were told that there had been a murder, that the victim was an elderly man. At that stage, we didn't know his identity from the police, but of course, from the information that we'd garnered from being on the ground, we realised that it was Eric Hinkston. We were told that he'd been killed by intruders who'd come into the house.
Being the victim of a burglary is something everyone dreads. But Eric and Audrey's home had been invaded by people who were willing to kill, and it terrified the whole community.
Murders in Plymouth are rare enough, but stranger murders are incredibly rare. And for something like this to happen, particularly to an older gentleman, it caused shockwaves. You know, we were shocked in the newsroom. The whole of the city of Plymouth was shocked.
It was all over the news, and that was the first time that I think it really hit me, in the sense that it was so close. Even at that age, you could feel the shock and everything going around. Everybody was talking about it, what was going on.
And one thing we wanted to do was A, to obtain information, and B, to provide some sort of community reassurance. And for that purpose, we parked a mobile mini incident room just here where these cars are now, outside the building. It gave people the opportunity to come to talk to the police, to give them information, to receive reassurance from them about the safety of the neighbourhood. When something like this happens, in a community as quiet and peaceful as this, people see burglars and murderers on every corner for several days.
Saturday, 30th of August, the day after the attack, Audrey, who was now staying at her son's house, said she was able to give a detailed description of the two intruders.
She said that she had a good sight of them before disturbing them and then making off.
One of the offenders had a very distinctive appearance, 6 feet 1 inches tall, wearing a deerstalker hat and white trousers, and that she'd seen him around the village on a number of occasions. His partner was a shorter guy, a bit stocky, 5 feet 8 inches tall.
One of the first lines of inquiry that the police gave us as the media was that they had these really clear descriptions of two young men that Audrey had seen come into the house and who were responsible for the attack on Eric.
With the whole community concerned that there were unknown killers at large, the story became nationwide news and the search for suspects intensified.
We had asked whether Audrey would be willing to give a press conference, and we didn't think to start with that she would. But all of a sudden the police came to us and said, actually, Audrey is going to give a press conference. Something that doesn't happen very often, and of course we all went along to it. There were an awful lot of us. The national media had become involved, as well as all of us local reporters, and we were all crammed into a little room. And then Audrey walked in with her son, and then she gave her statement.
During the early hours of Friday morning, 2 men came into my home and ruined my life. My husband Eric did not deserve this. As a frail man, any resistance he put up could easily have been overcome by these 2 young men. There was no need for them to go to the lengths they did.
I remember the room being incredibly quiet. You could hear a pin drop. This doesn't happen very often. Speaking to somebody who'd been there when such a terrible event had happened. And she was just a little old lady, grey hair and glasses. She looked, like your grandma.
Somebody somewhere knows who did this. I ask them, and my family asks them, to please contact the police. If you have any information at all, please pass it to the police. On a personal note, may I thank you for all the love and kindness you've shown us. But please, please do anything you can to help us. Thank you.
On the 1st of September 2003, Audrey Hingston had just given an emotional press conference, pleading for information on the 2 male burglars she said killed her husband. Her detailed descriptions of them had been circulated to the media.
It was obviously the lead story on all of the front pages of the newspapers and all of our news programmes that evening.
With all the public attention focused on these suspects, there was a result almost immediately.
They were quickly identified. In fact, having circulated their description, they came forward voluntarily. They were arrested.
We were told that arrests had been made, and we all sort of breathed a bit of a sigh of relief because, it was such a disturbing thing for the whole of the community.
That relief turned out to be short-lived when police questioned the 2 young men.
Inquiries were made into their background, and they didn't fit the profile at all of a burglar or anybody who might have committed this type of offence. They were resident in a bail hostel, which was within half a mile or so of the premises. We looked closely at the opportunity that the 2 guys might have had, but the bail hostel assured us that in accordance with their terms and their procedures, there was no way that these 2 people would have been out at that time of night. And the records showed that. And so, having been interviewed and their alibis substantiated, they were released.
We were all disappointed because clearly that created quite an issue for us, and we were all a bit confused as to why she identified these 2 individuals which clearly couldn't have been responsible.
Apparently these people were quite a common sight in the village. There's a pub next door, there was the butcher's shop and the pasty shop, so it's the sort of place that you'd expect young men to frequent.
The consensus of opinion was she must have seen them earlier that day and recalled seeing them due to the shock.
It felt a lot like the trail had gone cold, and we made regular calls to the police to try and find out if there were any updates, but there didn't seem to be any. And we were all wondering, are these people ever going to get caught?
Everybody was talking about it. I went to school and you could hear the teachers talking about it when they were having their breaks and that, and everybody was on edge.
The police were working around the clock, and despite the media appeals, there was still no leads. Something wasn't right.
We were looking at a burglary that had gone wrong. We thought it was strange that we didn't find any signs of fingerprints or even glove marks on any of the furniture or drawers that had been ransacked. Forensics found nothing of alien fingerprints or scenes of crime marks at all, which we thought was strange.
As there had been a struggle, police hoped that Eric's killers may have left their DNA on or around his body.
Clearly, this is one of the problems that was created by the paramedics. Quite rightly, of course. They would have been breathing over him, talking over him, touching him. Fibres from their clothes might have fallen onto him. That would have contaminated any type of DNA or fibre evidence that the offenders might have left on him. It took us some time, obviously, to obtain the uniforms and DNA samples from the paramedics.
But once the police lab had managed to identify and separate the traces left by the medical team, there was still no forensic evidence of the offenders inside the flat or out.
And that's one of the things that struck us as strange, because there was no disturbance under the window as you climbed through. No signs of entry, no dirt, no gravel, and it just didn't look right.
Whether somebody was wearing gloves or not, they will leave marks, i.e. you will see where they've pulled themselves into a room. If they pulled themselves through a window, you'll see something. Also, if somebody pulls themselves through a window, like in this particular instance, and they're wearing clothing, you would expect them to leave traces or fibres from the clothing on that scene of entry. We didn't get any.
By the 11th of September, Audrey's family were saying that they felt something wasn't right.
A tragic death like Eric's can have far-reaching consequences, and there were real concerns in the family that Audrey was holding something back. The police began to change the focus of their investigation.
Really and truly, at that time, none of us had considered Audrey as a suspect. It was unbelievable at that time. Everything that you'd expect to find from a burglary dwelling, we weren't finding. And then you think back to Audrey's account in the flat about seeing two men, and then you start to think, well, this isn't making sense.
And it's at that stage that we decided that we would have to look very closely at Audrey, because there was no forensics.
But before the police could pay Audrey a visit to find out more, she shocked everybody by attempting suicide. She took an overdose and left a note. Please catch these terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric.
She was detained in Derriford Hospital. Whether this was a real attempt at suicide or whether it was a ploy to put forward a picture of the aggrieved widow who couldn't live without her husband, I'm not sure. But we were also still aware of the family's feelings that Audrey wasn't being truthful, that Audrey was holding something back. And she had been treated for depression by her GP in Plimpton since June of that year, 2 or 3 months earlier, obviously.
Depression can affect someone profoundly. It affects you psychologically, physically. People might have difficulty getting up in the morning. They might struggle with insomnia. They might feel irritable, angry at other times. Hopelessness is something that people often feel. Loss of interest in life in general. They might even engage in reckless behaviour.
With Audrey in a fragile state recovering in hospital, detectives were unable to interview her. But they discreetly continued to investigate whether she was connected to Eric's death and not the burglars she'd claimed.
Bearing in mind, Audrey's son was an ex-police officer, we had to make sure that the information didn't leak out of the police station.
Police were doing a lot of forensic searching in the property. We saw them going in and out all the time.
We had to turn the negative aspects of the lack of forensic evidence into a positive, which is why we decided that we'd reconstruct the alleged entrance to the premises.
We specifically targeted some very, very fit individuals, police officers, to break in to the flat. And we were not surprised to find that they couldn't do it without leaving any trace. Bearing in mind, they tried to break in without leaving any trace of forensic evidence. They couldn't. That reinforced our beliefs that a burglary was pretty much impossible.
Although we'd searched the flat extensively during the early stages, we carried out another search and we found a long 7-inch butcher's knife down the side of the drawers, which is why it had been missed. Eric's post-mortem examination revealed that the cause of death was a single stab wound by a long, sharp-bladed instrument which had been forced down past his collarbone, puncturing his lung, which had collapsed, and, considering his state of health at the time, had led to his death.
They found traces of blood on the blade, which were later forensically examined. DNA came back as Eric's, and there were fingerprints on the knife of Audrey's.
And strangely enough, just the previous week, she'd asked James Hingston in the butcher shop to sharpen it for her. And so, eventually, we found the murder weapon.
On the night of Eric's death, Audrey had called 999 at 3:45 a.m. to report the attack.
We located a delivery driver who delivered some goods to the shop at around 2 a.m. the morning Eric was found dead. And he remembered hearing some groaning noises, like somebody was in pain, coming from one of the upstairs windows. Now we know Eric slept in a bedroom with the window open.
So he'd probably been stabbed at or just about that time.
After the post-mortem, we got some more information around the likely time of death, and that was a lot earlier than the telephone call put in by Audrey to the control room.
During this time, Audrey had been opening drawers, scattering their contents around the bedroom, filling a bin liner, possibly even while Eric was lying on the floor, still alive and in great pain.
The evidence was now only pointing in one direction, but it was hard to believe that Audrey could have killed Eric.
There were still a lot of officers who couldn't accept the fact that Audrey was a suspect. There were still people who just couldn't accept that she could have done it.
We had some social workers visit her in hospital, talk to her, and they came back and said something's not right. She wasn't exhibiting any signs of loss or grief. And the social workers picked up on this, as had the family. And so, again, that more or less confirmed our suspicion.
On the 7th of October 2003, Audrey was released from hospital and arrested on suspicion of Eric's murder.
You did feel that there was a lot of people watching. The other thing to remember is Audrey would have been the eldest female suspect arrested for murder. So it was quite a challenge, and we couldn't afford to get it wrong.
Police had taken Audrey Hingston into custody on the suspicion that she had murdered her husband, Eric. They'd found no evidence to back up her claim the crime had been committed by burglars.
We'd been calling the police constantly, asking for updates on the case, but it seemed to have gone very, very quiet. And then all of a sudden, one day, we were making our regular police calls, and they said that Audrey Hingston had been arrested. We were all completely shocked to suddenly be told that this 81-year-old lady who'd given that impassioned appeal at a press conference to find the people that had killed her husband, this little tiny old lady with curly grey hair, apparently done something so cold-blooded to the man that apparently was the love of her life. It was really shocking. We were incredulous.
What we don't know about Audrey is, who is she? I mean, has she shown sparks of aggressive behaviour throughout her life? We don't know. I think the thing is, seeing somebody as old comes with a stereotypical, they have no strength, they are a particular way. There is a perception that 81 years old is too old to commit crime, be violent, be aggressive. Clearly, that is not true.
In her interview at Crown Hill Police Station in Plymouth, Audrey wasn't admitting to anything and came up with yet another explanation.
Audrey then decided Eric must have committed suicide. As a result, she ransacked the flat and made it look like a burglary. She identified two men that she'd seen earlier in the day as being responsible for the burglary because she didn't want to embarrass the family.
As soon as Audrey changed her statement to police, aware the murder weapon had been identified, her son, a former detective, requested to see his mother in custody.
Peter came to the police station. His mother had been in custody some time, and he was with his wife. He wanted to see his mother, and we thought it would be useful if that was allowed. It's not common, but we allowed it.
We're at Crown Hill Police Station. This is the custody suite where Audrey would have been at the time she was under arrest. Her son and her son's family came to visit her And they had that conversation with her, and that's when Audrey told her son that she did in fact kill Eric.
Any relationship can become difficult or strained, but it's hard to imagine a situation where the only way out was to kill your partner.
She apparently fed up of caring for him. See, previously, Eric had been in good health. They had a car, they had a good social life, they travelled out a lot, they visited, local beauty spots, pubs, sandwich, and this had all disappeared. And this is this had caused a depression, and this is what culminated in the murder of Eric.
Without speaking to Audrey, we don't know what led to her breaking point. She may have felt frustrated, resentful, stressed, distressed, unable to ask for help, feeling that she'd lost her partner, going through in her mind what might have felt like a living bereavement. This is not the future I'd planned. He's become sick. Instead of going out and enjoying ourselves, he can't do what I hoped he could do with me. And that sense of frustration might have been bottled up until she finally blew.
Audrey's family now knew the truth, but police needed an official record of the confession, and this responsibility fell to her son.
I then said to him, Pete, I need a statement from you about what your mother said. Are you prepared to give me one? And he said, yeah, I don't want her looking silly.
I had a lot of sympathy for Peter and his family. It must have been awfully embarrassing for Peter, and I felt that for him.
I had to take my hat off to him because he did the right thing. But it must have been difficult.
For Audrey's family, it's incredibly shattering to discover that, their family member has committed such a crime, and they've literally got to rewrite their understanding of that person. It's incredibly painful. Everything you thought you knew about that person isn't anymore. You almost feel alienated from them.
Audrey Hingston could now be formally charged with the murder of her husband, Eric.
It was such a shock to hear that she'd been charged, but then to find out that she had actually confessed to killing Eric. Well, there was huge disbelief in the community. Nobody could believe that this little old lady could have done something so terrible.
Shocked, I was shocked. I think there was a lot of people that there was relief, because obviously at the time it was supposed to be a burglar. So I think, for as bad as it sounds, I think a lot of people were relieved. But there was still that shock that it was so close.
I spent a long time talking to Eric's family, to his son and daughter-in-law. They all lived and worked very closely together. They were very upset, very, very upset, particularly thinking about the way that she was willing to point the finger at two young men, give very accurate descriptions of two people who were then picked up and arrested, that she was willing to literally let them take the blame for what had happened. They really feel that she was an incredibly calculating woman.
It's, if you like, a double violation. First, you take away somebody we love, and then second of all, you lie to cover up your own guilt, to cover your tracks in such detail, to play the victim, speaks to quite a character from my point of view. But it's her age, the life stage, the violence and the lying that are an interesting cluster for me, and very surprising.
On the 3rd of December 2003, Eric Hingston was laid to rest alongside his first wife, Jean. 3 months later, on the 12th of March 2004, his second wife, Audrey, appeared at Plymouth Crown Court to answer for his death.
It was downgraded to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. I think in view of her age, her history of depression, and the fact that she didn't present any danger to to the public. It was not going to please everybody, particularly not the Hingston family.
So this is Plymouth Crown Court. We were expecting to come here for a trial to start, something that was possibly 2 or 3 weeks long. And in fact, it all happened in just one day. It was a plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. So actually, in the courtroom, there weren't very many people, not even Eric's own family, because they didn't expect it to happen either.
Eric's family weren't happy with the way the court case went.
So one of the things that happened as part of this court hearing was that there was a victim impact statement read to the court. On behalf of Eric's family, Jimmy Hingston gave that statement, but he actually gave it at a time when he still thought that Audrey was a victim. So it was fairly sympathetic to her and the work that she'd done in looking after Eric. If they'd given a different witness impact statement, that was after they found out that Audrey had been charged with his killing, it might have been very different.
Audrey Hingston was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and sentenced to 2 years in prison.
I think she was very lucky to get away with manslaughter in 2 years.
As far as Eric's family are concerned, they felt that the sentence was very lenient. They weren't able to give their say. They weren't even told that it was happening on that day, so they didn't come. They didn't see Audrey for that final time. They did appeal against the sentence to try and get it increased, but it never was. And I think that Eric's family certainly feel that they didn't get justice for him in this courtroom.
In 2004, aged 81, Audrey Hingston became the oldest woman to be jailed in Britain. She served 1 year of her sentence before she was released. She died 12 years later in 2016.
I've covered an awful lot of murder trials in my time and horrendous cases, but this one has always lived with me. I think partly because we were also taken in by Audrey from the beginning. You know, you don't see very many elderly ladies giving press conferences like that. And, you know, we all felt like we'd been hoodwinked by her, I suppose. And in particular, the fact that she only served a year for taking the life of Eric just felt like a slap in the face for the Hingston family.
I understand that she was under probably quite a lot of mental pressure. However, if there was a cry for help, ask for help. It's rather extreme to stab your husband when he's asleep in bed.
You've got here a man who'd flown missions into Europe during the war. He'd been a businessman, a licensee, a butcher, worked hard all his life. To end it like this was not, I'm sure, not the way that he would have expected to die, and wasn't right. And I don't think he did get justice. No.
For Eric and Audrey Hingston, his illness changed everything. And incredibly, the only way out for Audrey was to commit the unthinkable.